nature. And then, the fight that Einstein had against Bohr and Heisenberg and others, Einstein with Planck, was whether we simply don't know everything yet, and that's why the phenomena appear random, or if, as Heisenberg would say, there's a fundamental unknowability in the very small because the process itself simply isn't determined. That became, give you one more example of this. This is the, you may have heard the term of spooky action at a distance, which is a quote of Einstein about some of this, where he used the example of a particle, I think he used a light photon striking a plate, which would emit an X-ray, which would then strike another plate, and then turn back into a photon. And he says between the two plates, as the X-ray is acting as a wave, somehow, when it strikes the next plate, all the other parts of the wave have to know that the event already happened over here. They have to communicate with each other faster than light instantly to make this wave collapse happen, which Einstein thought was spooky. Now, the fight sort of continued. Bohm had introduced the idea that he said, well, there's hidden variables. There are things we don't know yet, but which we could know in the future. We just don't know everything yet. And maybe we won't be able to discover them soon. But the particles themselves, nature itself, does know what it's going to do. Our lack of knowledge doesn't mean that there's a lack of determinism in the actual nature of things in the real universe. And then what I wanted to focus on was this, what's called Bell's inequality, named after John Bell, who in 1964 proposed an experiment that he said would show definitively whether our knowledge was limited or whether the universe itself was undetermined, that there was a statistical nature, a sort of randomness that was inherent in the very nature of things. So the tests were performed of this Bell's inequality, which basically, it's kind of a complicated thing, but the gist of it is that he showed that he made this might be too much detail, but that's okay. He made two entangled particles, which would have a correlated polarization. And he showed that by doing something to one of them, you would change the behavior of the other one, even though that would have to require something faster than light. And it would mean that the behavior of this particle was not predetermined from the time that it was created. That what its later behavior would be depended on what its partner did. So, in showing this, he said that means there are no hidden variables. What the particle would do was not predetermined. There was no actual state of nature, and causality simply doesn't exist that way. And this is supposedly, shows that Einstein was wrong, that he was an old fuddy-duddy who never got with it on the quantum front. But let me read you something about causality. This is from the book Where is Science Going?, which is a collection of essays by Planck, and it ends with a discussion between Einstein, Planck, and an interviewer. So let me read this. The interviewer says to Einstein here, he says, "In what sense, then, do you apply determinism to nature? In the sense that every event in nature proceeds from another event, which we call the cause?" Einstein answers, "I should hardly put it that way. In the first place, I think that much of the misunderstanding encountered in all this question of causation is due to the rather rudimentary formulation of the causal principle, which has been in vogue until now. When Aristotle and the scholastics defined what they meant by a cause, the idea of objective experiment, in the scientific sense, had not yet arisen. Therefore, they were content with defining the metaphysical concept of cause. And the same is true of Kant. Newton seems to have realized that this pre-scientific formulation of the causal principle would prove insufficient for modern physics. And Newton was content to describe the regular order in which events happen in nature and to construct his synthesis on the basis of mathematical laws. Now, I believe that events in nature are controlled by a much stricter and more closely binding law than we suspect today, when we speak of one event being the cause of another. Our concept here is confined to one happening within one time section. It is dissected from the whole process. Our present rough way of applying the causal principle is quite superficial. We are like a child who judges a poem by the rhyme and knows nothing of the rhythmic pattern. Or we are like a juvenile learner at the piano, just relating one note to that which immediately precedes or follows. To an extent, this may be very well when one is dealing with very simple and primitive compositions, but it will not do for the interpretation of a Bach fugue. Quantum physics has presented us with very complex processes, and to meet them, we must further enlarge and refine our concept of causality. Now, on refining, on expanding, on further developing this concept of causality, I think it's impossible to ignore the question of time and of sense perception. The outlook of Bohr, for example, against Einstein was that the purpose of physics was just to explain appearances. He said, Einstein said that physics is about what is. Bohr said, forget it. The job of the quantum theorist is to describe what we will see. There is no is in physics for Bohr. There's just the accurate prediction of appearances. And he said that's as far as you can go.
Now you have another thing. We use sense perception, and we often talk about sense perception. But is sense perception real? Is it really real? Or is there a higher order of processes involved? Because mankind does something that no other known species does. Mankind is capable of actual creativity. Now, it's true that most people in society today do not know what creativity is. They don't know what human creativity is. So they mystify the whole thing. But the fact of the matter is that you have a precursor of time that is an ordinary time, of animal time, in man. Because man is able to foresee and act upon to cause the result of foreseeing in behavior. And no other animal can do that. Unfortunately, most people have difficulty because they're stupefied into believing in simple causality. They don't see the fact that the future is acting on the present. In human discovery, the actual discovery of a human principle and its application to society, you are actually running with a precursor of that experience. Now, that precursor defines the difference between man and the animal. Not all men and so forth, because many of them are stupid. They prefer to be stupid and make simple deductions. But the creative personality, like Einstein, for example, or Planck, for example, or Riemann, for example, many cases, or the case of Kepler. Kepler, his whole conception of the organization of space is based on a precursor principle, beyond time. In other words, something in advance of what you call your time schedule is actually determining the course of events. The most interesting case, of course, is human creativity. And you get, for example, when you take the creativity, take Bach, say simply the preludes and fugues. It poses the same kind of question. What you're going to do downstream on time is going to determine what the effect is. In other words, you were limited in choices. In order to perform a fugue, you're limited in choices. You have to anticipate or have an inherent anticipation in time of the note you're going to hit and the ordering of it. And any actually creative scientist is doing the same thing. Otherwise, their work is not creative. Science is never defined by deduction. It's always defined by the future. So once you take these kinds of evidence, like life itself, principle of life, the fact that human beings have a capability which no animal has in terms of forecasting. Pigs, for example, can forecast, but they can't forecast. Pigs are very good at forecasting earthquakes. The pigs will know the earthquake is coming before any human being will. Unless they're working as a scientist, no? But the pig cannot use forecasting to change the characteristic of society, of the space we live in. Yeah. Human beings can do that. A limited number of human beings who are actually creative are able to forecast, and I do it myself. So it's not something unknowable. It's something which people just don't know because they're taught not to know it. They're told that society works in a certain way. They live in a society which has certain rules. And the people are suppressed by the fact that they're given rules which are dictated to them internally. They accept that dictation, knowing they're going to be punished if they violate the rule. And therefore, what they're capable of doing as human beings, they're not unable to do because of this kind of prohibition. So the problem here is that there are these factors which include the meaning of life, the fact that if we can see the future because we are able to be creative, if we can see the future, well, where does all this go? And so therefore what we're doing is we have an oversimplified argument, which is foolish people use as an argument to justify their ignorance. Now let's look at what's wrong with sense perception. Now let us retrain sense perception intellectually. So we have to retrain sense perception so you no longer are a baboon, you're a human being. And the difference between a baboon and a human being is we don't believe in sense perception. We acknowledge that it exists as a phenomenon, a biological phenomenon. But it doesn't determine the human will, and especially not the human will. You go outside sense perception. Now you attack sense perception as a subject, which is what Kepler does. Attack sense perception as a subject. It is not a valid form of existence. It's only an imperfect way of finding your way in the darkness when you don't have a light. So therefore you say, well, I've got to find, my eyesight isn't working, or I'm blind. How can I understand what's going on around me if I'm blind? And so therefore the science is based on going outside sense perception and finding things that are deemed to be mystical in what some people's terms. What are these influences which determine what sense perception cannot determine or accurately determine? We are in the universe, and it's the universe which we are controlled by, and it's on the universe as the universe that we have to react and free ourselves from the chains of sense perception. And that's physics.